The piano keys were an enemy tonight. Elena Morrison's fingers flew across them, chasing a melody that felt more like a frantic escape than a piece of music. Under the harsh glare of a single lamp, her knuckles were white, her shoulders tight with a pain that had settled deep into her bones. Rain hammered against the window of the tiny practice room, a frantic, percussive beat that matched the pounding in her head. This audition, the one that could change everything, felt less like an opportunity and more like a cliff's edge. One wrong note, and she would fall. She played the final, thundering chord, and the sound hung in the air, vibrating through the floorboards. Then silence. The only noise left was the storm raging outside and the ragged sound of her own breathing. Exhaustion hit her like a physical blow. She felt 100 years old as she gathered her worn sheet music, her body aching with a fatigue that no amount of sleep could fix. Her reflection in the dark window was a ghost, pale, tired, with eyes that held too much worry for a 25-year-old. The moment she stepped outside, the New Orleans night swallowed her whole. The wind was a living thing, tearing down the narrow cobblestone street and whipping rain into her face. She fumbled with her cheap umbrella, the one she'd bought for $5 at a corner store. It felt flimsy in her hands, a pathetic shield against the fury of the storm. She pushed it open, and for a glorious second it held. Then a vicious gust caught it, turning it inside out with a sickening crack of metal and fabric. Useless. Just like everything else, it was broken. A bitter, defeated sound caught in her throat. She threw the mangled thing into a nearby bin, pulling the collar of her thin coat up around her ears. It did little to stop the cold that was already seeping into her skin. Head down, she hurried on, her cheap flats slipping on the slick, ancient stones of the French Quarter. The wrought iron balconies overhead seemed to weep black tears onto the street below. All she wanted was her apartment, her bed, a moment of quiet. She didn't see the car until it was too late. She stepped off the curb, her mind on the warmth she didn't have, and was suddenly blinded. 2 perfect circles of light cut through the downpour, freezing her in place. A squeal of tires screamed against the wet pavement, a sound of pure panic. A clap of thunder exploded directly overhead, so loud it shook the very air she breathed. The world became a blur of light and noise and a terrifying, crushing force. Her last thought was of the music, a frantic, unfinished melody. Then, there was only darkness. Elena's first breath was a sharp intake of a scent she couldn't place. It was rich and complicated, a blend of old books, expensive bourbon, and something floral, like roses left out in the rain. Her consciousness surfaced slowly, like a swimmer rising from deep, dark water. The next thing she registered was the impossible softness beneath her, sheets so smooth they felt like cool silk against her skin. Her head throbbed with a dull, persistent ache. She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness pushed her back against a mountain of pillows. Her eyes fluttered open. This was not her apartment. She was in an enormous bed, the kind with a dark, carved wooden headboard that reached halfway to the ceiling. The room was vast and shadowed, furnished with heavy, antique pieces that seemed to absorb the light. Thick velvet curtains, the color of dried blood, were drawn against the day, but a sliver of gray light escaped, illuminating dust motes dancing in the silent air. On the nightstand beside her, a single crystal vase held a bouquet of deep red roses, their petals still beaded with moisture. A faint sound drew her gaze across the room. A man stood with his back to her, looking out the window at a balcony with intricate iron railings. The city beyond was a watercolor of gray rain. He was tall, his frame filling the space, his stillness a silent, commanding presence. He must have heard her stir. He turned slowly, and Elena's breath caught in her throat. He was imposing, dressed in a simple dark shirt that did nothing to hide the breadth of his shoulders. His face was all sharp angles and shadows, handsome in a way that felt dangerous. A faint, silvery scar cut a line near his temple, and as he moved closer, she saw the older, more pronounced scars that crisscrossed the backs of his hands. His eyes, a startlingly clear gray, met hers, and they held no apology, only a calm, unnerving assessment. "You're awake," he said. His voice was a low rumble, a sound that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. It wasn't unkind, but it held an authority that sent a shiver down her spine. Elena found her voice, though it came out as a weak rasp. "Where am I? What happened?" He stopped a few feet from the bed, his hands clasped loosely behind his back. "There was an accident. In the storm. My car hit you." He delivered the words like facts from a report, devoid of emotion. "I brought you here." Her mind raced, trying to connect the dots through the fog in her head. The blinding headlights, the screech of tires. A hospital. I should be in a hospital. A hospital would mean police, he stated, his gaze unwavering. And police ask questions I don't answer. The simple sentence landed with the force of a physical blow. The air in the room grew colder, thicker. This wasn't a rescue. This was something else entirely. Fear, cold and sharp, began to prickle beneath her skin. "My doctor has seen you," he continued, his tone softening just enough to be unsettling. "You have a mild concussion and some bruises. You will be fine." He paused, letting his words sink in, letting her understand the full scope of her situation. "You will stay here until you are healed and the storm outside has passed." His eyes darkened, his gaze growing heavy, and she knew he wasn't just talking about the weather. "No one will harm you under my roof." It was a promise of protection, but it sounded like a verdict. The velvet curtains, the soft bed, the fragrant roses, they weren't comforts. They were the beautiful, ornate bars of a cage. The next day, the headache had softened to a dull, persistent throb behind her eyes. Elena pushed herself out of the enormous bed, her bare feet sinking into a thick Persian rug. The silence of the house was a heavy blanket, muffling the world outside. She felt a desperate need to move, to test the boundaries of this beautiful prison. She opened the bedroom door and stepped into a long, sunlit hallway. Everything was polished to a gleam. Dark wood floors shone, and portraits of stern-faced ancestors watched her from the walls. She passed a young woman in a crisp black dress dusting a marble statue. The maid's eyes flickered towards her for a second before dropping to the floor, her focus suddenly intent on her work. A little further on, a man polished a silver tray, his back ramrod straight. He didn't acknowledge her presence at all. It was as if she were a ghost, seen but not to be engaged with. A chill ran down her spine. His power wasn't just in his presence, it was in the absolute obedience of everyone who lived within these walls. She followed the light, her hand trailing along a cool, smooth wall. It led her to a pair of tall, carved double doors slightly ajar. Curiosity, stronger than her fear, made her push one open. Her breath hitched. The room was dedicated entirely to music. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the rich wood of a cello leaning in one corner and the intricate inlay of a music stand in another. But at the center of it all, commanding the space, was a magnificent grand piano. Its black lacquer was so deep it looked like a pool of still water, the ivory of its keys a stark, perfect white. It was immaculate, not a speck of dust on its surface, as if it were waiting for her. She moved towards it, drawn by an invisible string. Her life, her passion, her entire identity was contained in those 88 keys. Tentatively, she reached out and traced the line of them with her fingertips, feeling the familiar cool smoothness. The urge to play was a physical ache, a desperate, clawing need to feel the vibrations under her hands, to create something that was hers alone. "It suits the room, don't you think?" His voice came from the doorway, as quiet as the rest of the house, yet it made her jump. Marcus stood there, leaning against the doorframe, watching her with those unnervingly calm gray eyes. He hadn't asked her to play. The question was worse, somehow. More intimate. "It's a beautiful instrument," she replied, her voice carefully neutral. She pulled her hand back as if the keys had burned her. He walked into the room, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't look at her, but at the piano. "My mother played," he said, his voice softer now. "Chopin. Always Chopin. She said he knew how to make a piano weep." He finally turned his gaze on her. "What do you play?" It was a verbal chess match. Every question was a move, designed to corner her. "Whatever is required," she said, the answer clipped and defensive. A flicker of something, disappointment? Amusement, crossed his face. A professional answer. He stopped a few feet away from her. "Your phone is in the top drawer of the nightstand. I had it turned off. For your privacy. No one will disturb your recovery." She felt a cold dread creep up her spine. It was an act of control disguised as care. "My audition has been rescheduled," he finished smoothly. "I took the liberty of explaining you had a family emergency." He paused, letting the weight of his control settle over her. "I also took care of the lease on your old apartment. The landlord was quite understanding. Your things are in the room down the hall." The floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet. Her apartment. Her life. He had packed it all up and brought it here. She had nothing left out there. No reason to leave. No way to leave. Elena looked from his unreadable face to the perfect, silent piano. It wasn't a gift. It wasn't an oasis. It was the centerpiece of her gilded cage, and he was the one holding the key. The days began to blur, each one a copy of the last, painted in shades of gray light and polished wood. The silence of the house was no longer just heavy, it was becoming familiar. Elena found herself watching for him, listening for the sound of his footsteps in the hall. They fell into a strange, unspoken rhythm. Sometimes they would drink coffee in the cavernous kitchen late at night, the steam from their mugs swirling between them in the quiet. They rarely spoke of anything important, but the silences were filled with a tension that hummed in the air, a live wire she was terrified and thrilled to touch. She was healing. The bruises on her skin were fading from angry purple to a soft, mottled green, and the headache was finally gone. But a new ache had taken its place, a confusing flutter in her chest whenever Marcus looked at her for a moment too long. She hated it. She hated him for the control he held over her, but a treacherous part of her was drawn to the steady, dangerous calm he radiated. One evening, the sky turned a bruised, angry color, promising another storm. The air grew thick and heavy with the scent of rain. Elena found herself on the balcony outside his study, her hands gripping the cool, intricate iron railings. She watched the clouds roll in, a dark tide swallowing the city. "It will be a bad one," he said from behind her. She didn't jump this time. She had felt his presence before he spoke. "New Orleans weather," she said, trying for a casual tone. "It's never boring." He came to stand beside her, leaning his forearms on the railing. He was close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, a stark contrast to the cooling air. They stood in silence for a long moment, watching lightning spiderweb across the distant sky. Her boldness felt reckless, born from days of pent-up frustration and a desperate need to understand the man who held her life in his hands. "What happened?" she asked, her voice quiet. She didn't look at him, but she felt his body tense. "I told you. An accident." "Not the accident," she clarified, finally turning to meet his gaze. She lifted a hand and pointed tentatively towards his face. "The scar. By your temple." His gray eyes darkened, the calm surface rippling. A muscle in his jaw tightened. He didn't answer, instead looking back out at the approaching storm. "Scars are just stories the body refuses to forget," he said, his voice a low rumble. He turned the question on her, his gaze sharp and piercing. "What are you afraid of, Elena?" The question caught her off guard, disarming her completely. She looked away, her own secrets feeling suddenly exposed. The truth came out before she could stop it, a raw and honest whisper. "Losing control," she admitted. "Having my future decided for me by someone else." The irony was so thick it was suffocating. She was describing her exact situation, here in this beautiful house, with this powerful, controlling man. He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was dangerously soft. "Sometimes the safest place to be is the one where you give up control to the right person." Her heart hammered against her ribs. It wasn't a threat, and it wasn't a comfort. It was a terrifying proposition. A sudden gust of wind swept across the balcony, carrying the first cold drops of rain. It whipped a strand of her hair across her face and raised goosebumps on her arms. She shivered, a small, involuntary tremor. He noticed immediately. Before she could react, he was shrugging out of his dark jacket. He moved with a surprising grace, stepping behind her and draping it over her shoulders. The jacket was heavy, the fine wool still holding the warmth of his body. It smelled of him, that same scent of bourbon and something clean, like rain on stone. The simple, protective gesture was so unexpected, so intimate, it sent a jolt through her entire body. It was more shocking than a threat, more potent than a kiss. The weight of it felt like a claim, and beneath the fabric, her skin burned. His jacket was gone from her shoulders, but the memory of its weight lingered, a phantom warmth that made her skin prickle. For 2 days after their encounter on the balcony, Elena avoided the music room. The grand piano felt like a trap, another tool of his control. To play it would be to surrender, to perform for her captor. But the silence was beginning to suffocate her, and the need to feel the solid weight of the keys beneath her fingers was a desperate, clawing thing inside her chest. Finally, she couldn't fight it anymore. She walked into the sunlit room and sat on the polished bench, her reflection a pale ghost on the gleaming black lacquer. Her hands trembled as she lifted them over the keyboard. She felt like a traitor to herself. But then she touched the keys, and the world outside the music fell away. She started tentatively, a simple, melancholic melody that was more whisper than song. The notes were fragile, uncertain. But as her fingers remembered their purpose, the music deepened. She closed her eyes, letting the familiar motions take over, pouring all her fear and confusion and the terrifying, forbidden flicker of attraction into the sound. The melody grew stronger, more complex, a storm of chords and frantic arpeggios that filled every corner of the silent house. For the first time since the accident, she wasn't a victim or a prisoner. She was a pianist. She was herself. The music was a declaration. I am still here. The final, powerful chord echoed into nothingness. Elena held her breath, her fingers still resting on the keys, the vibration humming up through her bones. The silence that rushed back and was absolute, profound. She felt raw, as if she had just stripped her soul bare for the empty room to see. Thank you? The voice came from the shadows of the doorway. It was quiet, stripped of its usual command, and it made her heart stop dead in her chest. Marcus stepped into the light. He wasn't looking at her with his usual cool assessment. His hard expression was gone, replaced by something unguarded and raw. The music had smoothed the sharp edges of his face, leaving behind a stillness that looked almost like peace. For a terrifying second, he didn't look like a monster at all. He walked further into the room, his eyes fixed on the piano as if it were a sacred object. I haven't heard music like that in this house since I was a boy. The moment of vulnerability vanished as quickly as it had appeared. He stopped a few feet away, his expression hardening back into its familiar mask of control. You are healing, he stated. It wasn't a question. She nodded, unable to speak. That is good, he continued, his tone all business now. Because the storm I mentioned is not over. In fact, it's getting worse. He met her eyes, and the calm gray was gone, replaced by something cold and serious. My enemies are aware of you. They know I have a guest. Her blood ran cold. He had painted a target on her back. He saw the fear in her eyes and took a step closer. I told you I would protect you, and I will. He paused, letting the weight of his promise settle in the air between them. Then he laid his terms on the table, the words as clear and sharp as broken glass. Stay here, Elena. Let me keep you safe. No one can touch you inside these walls. He looked from her face to the piano and back again. In return, fill this house with music. The air left her lungs in a silent rush. There it was. The implicit deal made brutally, terrifyingly explicit. It wasn't a kindness. It was a transaction. Her safety for her freedom. Her life for her art. He was offering her a cage, and all she had to do was sing for him. The deal hung in the air between them, a silent, binding contract. Elena played the piano every day, and in return, the gilded cage remained locked and safe. The music was her shield, but it was also the sound of her surrender. A strange, fragile peace settled over the house. She and Marcus continued their late-night coffees, the conversation still skirting the edges of anything real, but the tension had a new name now: acceptance. She had chosen this. That peace shattered one afternoon. She was walking past the heavy oak door of his study when she heard his voice, sharp and cold as ice. The door was cracked open just enough for the sound to snake out into the hallway. "I don't care what he thinks he's owed," Marcus snapped, his voice a low, lethal growl she had never heard before. "Falcone doesn't make the rules in this city. Not while I'm still breathing." Elena froze, her hand flying to her throat. Falcone. The name sounded like a threat. There was a pause. She could hear the faint, tinny sound of someone speaking on the other end of the line. "Find him," Marcus commanded, his voice dropping even lower, laced with a quiet fury that was more terrifying than any shout. "And you remind him what happens when a dog gets off its leash. Make it clear." The line went dead with a sharp click. Elena didn't wait to hear more. She hurried away, her heart hammering against her ribs. The man who had looked at her with something soft in his eyes after she played the piano was gone. In his place was the monster she had first imagined, a crime lord who spoke of men like they were animals to be put down. The beautiful, silent house suddenly felt cold again, its shadows filled with unseen dangers. Later that evening, restlessness drove her from her room. She wandered the upper hallways, her footsteps silent on the thick runners. As she passed a small alcove near a service staircase, she heard the hushed murmur of voices. Two of Marcus's guards stood there, their broad shoulders nearly filling the narrow space. They spoke in low, worried tones, believing they were alone. "Falcone's getting bold," the first one said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "This is different. He's not just hitting cargo anymore. It's the girl," the second guard replied, his voice tight. "The boss has never done this before. Bringing someone here." He shook his head. "Falcone sees a new vulnerability. A guest in the house is a weakness you can't guard with a gun." Elena's blood turned to ice. The girl. A weakness. The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. She was the vulnerability. She wasn't a guest being protected, she was a liability being managed. A soft target. She backed away slowly, her breath catching in her throat, the guard's words echoing in her mind. The threat wasn't just an abstract storm anymore, it had a name, and it was watching her. The next day, a courier delivered a small, plain brown box. A servant brought it to Marcus in the library where Elena was trying, and failing, to lose herself in a book. Marcus took the box, his expression unreadable as he slit the tape with a silver letter opener. He lifted the lid, and a sudden, deathly stillness fell over him. It was as if every muscle in his body had turned to stone. His jaw clenched, and the scar near his temple seemed to darken. Without a word, he turned the box and tilted it so she could see inside. Elena gasped, a chill sweeping over her skin that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Nestled on a bed of black tissue paper was a single red rose. It was the same deep, velvety color as the ones he kept in her room. But this one was horribly, deliberately crushed. Its stem was snapped, its petals bruised and limp, as if it had been plucked from a gutter after a violent storm. It was a message, delivered with brutal, intimate precision. It was a promise of what they would do to Marcus's beautiful, fragile thing. The storm wasn't coming anymore. It had just broken down the door. After that, everything changed. The fragile warmth that had begun to grow between them was extinguished, leaving behind a cold, hard emptiness. Marcus became a ghost in his own house, a passing shadow in the hallway, his face a mask of stone. The man who had listened to her music with a raw, unguarded expression was gone. In his place was a cold, distant commander. He found her by the window in her bedroom the next morning, watching the city wake up. He didn't enter the room, just stood in the doorway, his presence filling the space. "For your safety," he said, his voice flat and devoid of any emotion. "You will remain on this floor. The staff will bring you anything you need." It wasn't a request. It was an order. The finality in his tone left no room for argument. Elena turned from the window, her heart a cold knot in her stomach. "You're locking me in." "I'm keeping you alive," he corrected her, his gray eyes like chips of ice. And then he was gone, his footsteps receding down the hall, leaving her in a silence that was suddenly suffocating. The upper floor was a world unto itself, a sprawling collection of luxurious rooms that now felt like a single, shrinking cell. The walls of her gilded cage, once invisible, were now solid and pressing in on her. She paced the length of the hallway, her bare feet silent on the plush carpets, touching the cool wood of doors that led to places she could no longer go. The grand staircase that swept down to the main floor might as well have been a cliff's edge. The music room, her one sanctuary, was forbidden territory. The beautiful piano sat silent 2 floors below, a constant, mocking reminder of the bargain she had made. The separation was absolute, a chilling test of her ability to endure the gilded prison he had built. 2 days of this was enough to make her feel like she was losing her mind. She needed air. Not the filtered, temperature-controlled air of the house, but real, humid New Orleans air, thick with the scent of jasmine and damp earth. She found the young maid from her first day, the one with the downcast eyes, carrying a tray of fresh towels. Her name was Sophia. Elena stopped her in the hall, her voice low and desperate. "Please," she whispered. "Just for 5 minutes. The garden. I need to feel the sun." Sophia's eyes widened in fear, and she shook her head, clutching the towels to her chest like a shield. "I can't. Mr. O'Connor gave strict orders." "He'll never know," Elena pressed, her own desperation surprising her. "No one will see. I just need to breathe." She saw a flicker of pity in the younger woman's eyes, a shared understanding of being trapped by a powerful man's will. After a long, agonizing moment, Sophia gave a tiny, terrified nod. She led Elena down a narrow service staircase, her shoes making soft, panic sounds on the wooden steps. The door to the garden was heavy, but it opened onto a burst of green and color. For a glorious minute, Elena felt free. She walked into the small, walled garden, a hidden jewel of stone paths and overgrown rose bushes. She closed her eyes and tilted her face to the sky, breathing in the thick, warm air. It was the first real breath she'd taken in days. Her eyes drifted to the high brick wall, topped with intimidating wrought iron spikes. Through the bars of the heavy back gate, she could see the quiet street beyond. A dark sedan was parked there. It was nondescript, the kind of car you would never notice, which was precisely why she noticed it. The windows were tinted, but she could just make out the silhouette of a person in the driver's seat, watching the house. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs. It wasn't a coincidence. As if sensing her gaze, the figure in the car shifted. Elena froze, one hand gripping the back of a stone bench. She was visible through the bars of the gate, a clear shot. They saw her. For a long, terrifying second, nothing happened. Then, the car's engine rumbled to life. With a squeal of tires on the pavement, it sped away, disappearing around the corner. The brief taste of freedom curdled in her mouth, replaced by the bitter tang of pure fear. They knew who she was. They knew where she was. And they were waiting. The walls Marcus had built to protect her were meaningless. They were just watching the cage, waiting for the bird to show itself. The terror that had frozen her in the garden ignited into a white-hot fury. She wasn't a bird in a cage. She was bait in a trap. Elena turned and ran, her feet flying across the stone path, back to the service door. Sophia was waiting there, her face pale with panic. Elena pushed past her without a word, her mind fixed on a single purpose. She was done being managed. She was done being protected. She was done with the lies. She didn't stop at the service stairs. She burst into the main hallway and took the grand staircase 2 steps at a time, her hand flying over the polished banister. The rule he had given her, stay on this floor, was nothing more than ash in her mouth. She didn't know where his study was, but she followed the simmering rage in her veins, a compass pointing directly to him. She found the door at the end of a long hall and threw it open without knocking. Marcus was standing behind a massive dark wood desk, a phone pressed to his ear. He looked up, his eyes widening in surprise for a fraction of a second before hardening into cold fury. "I'll call you back," he said into the phone and hung up, the click echoing in the tense silence. "Go back to your room," he commanded, his voice dangerously low. "No," she shot back, her voice shaking but defiant. She walked further into the room, his personal fortress of leather and bourbon. "I'm done with my room. I'm done with this cage." His jaw tightened. "You disobeyed me. They saw me," she said, her voice rising with every word. "There was a car watching the house, and they saw me in the garden. Don't you dare tell me I'm safer locked away upstairs. You didn't lock me in for my safety. You locked me in because I'm the target." He didn't deny it. The muscle in his jaw was the only sign of the storm brewing behind his eyes. "I am handling it." "Handling it?" she cried, the sound close to a hysterical laugh. "I refuse to be a pawn in your game, Marcus. I refuse to be some nameless, faceless vulnerability your men whisper about in the hallways. I deserve the truth. All of it." She took another step, closing the distance between them, her fear forgotten, replaced by a desperate need to make him see her as a person, not a problem. "Who is Falcone? Why does he want to hurt me? I have a right to know whose war I've been dragged into." Her words hung in the air, a direct challenge to his authority, to his control, to everything he was. She expected him to explode, to yell, to drag her from the room. Instead, something inside him seemed to break. The cold fury in his eyes drained away, leaving behind a weariness so profound it seemed to age him by a decade. He ran a scarred hand over his face, a gesture of defeat. "Falcone is a rival," he said, his voice rough, stripped of its command. "He's trying to start a war. He's reckless. He thinks hitting me where I'm vulnerable will prove he's strong." He finally met her eyes, and what she saw there stole her breath. It was guilt. "I brought you here. I painted the target on your back. It's my fault." The confession was so direct, so honest, it knocked the anger right out of her. He moved from behind the desk, his movements slow, uncertain. He stopped in front of her, so close she could see the faint lines around his eyes. "I learned a long time ago never to show anyone what you care about," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's a lesson you only have to learn once." His hand went to the collar of his dark shirt. With a slow, deliberate movement, he unfastened the top 2 buttons. He pulled the fabric aside, revealing the scarred skin of his collarbone. But this scar was different from the silvery lines on his hands and temple. It was a deep, puckered, ugly thing, a story of brutal, intimate violence. "This was from a man I called my brother," Marcus said, his gaze distant, lost in a memory that was clearly still bleeding. "He let an enemy into my home because he was offered a bigger piece of the city. They came for me when I was sleeping. I learned that night that the most dangerous threats aren't the ones you face on the street. They're the ones you invite inside. The ones you allow yourself to value." He let the shirt fall back into place, but the image of the scar was burned into her mind. He looked at her then, and his eyes were raw, stripped of all their defenses. All the control, the distance, the coldness, it was all a shield, and it was now lying in pieces at their feet. "And you," he said, his voice cracking with the weight of the confession, "you are the first beautiful thing I have brought into this house in a decade." His gaze held hers, intense and devastating. "That makes you my weakness." His words hung in the air, a confession so raw it seemed to bleed into the silence of the room. "My weakness." The phrase should have terrified her. It should have sent her running, made her feel the target on her back more keenly than ever. But as Elena looked at the man stripped bare of his armor, something else took root in her chest. Not fear, but a cold, sharp clarity. The fear was still there, a humming wire beneath her skin, but it was overshadowed by a sudden, fierce anger. She had been a piece on a board she didn't understand, a fragile object to be hidden away. He saw her as a liability, a problem to be managed. Falcone saw her as a tool to break him. They were both wrong. "No," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with a strength that surprised them both. Marcus looked up, his expression confused, the rawness in his eyes shuddering again. "No? You're wrong," she repeated, taking a step closer to the desk, claiming the space as her own. "I'm not your weakness." He shook his head, a weary, dismissive gesture. "Elena, you don't understand the world you're in. No, you don't understand the asset you have," she shot back, her voice gaining power. "This man, Falcone, he's watching you. He thinks he knows you. He orchestrated my accident because he expected you to react a certain way. To hide me. To show fear. To create a weakness." She leaned forward, her hands flat on the polished wood of his desk. "You've been playing his game exactly as he wrote it." A flicker of something, shock, maybe even respect, crossed his face. He stared at her, truly seeing her for the first time not as a victim, but as a strategist. "I'm a performer, Marcus," she said, the words coming faster now, her mind racing. "My entire life is about perception. It's about controlling what an audience sees, what they feel. It's about holding 1,000 people in absolute silence with nothing but my hands and a plan." She straightened up, her gaze unwavering. "You see a pianist. He sees a songbird in a cage. Neither of you sees a weapon." The silence that followed was different. It wasn't empty or tense, it was charged, filled with a dawning possibility. Marcus looked from her determined face to the city map pinned on the wall behind him, his mind clearly working, re-evaluating everything he thought he knew. "What are you suggesting?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "I'm suggesting we stop reacting and start performing," she said. "We give Falcone the show he wants. We make him believe his plan is working perfectly. We lure him in, make him feel safe, make him feel like he's in control. And then, when he's right where we want him, we change the ending." He walked around the desk until he was standing beside her, their shoulders almost touching. He smelled of bourbon and the clean, sharp scent of his own resolve. He looked down at her, and the last traces of pity were gone from his eyes, replaced by a keen, assessing intelligence. "This is dangerous. If you make one mistake, a wrong note can ruin an entire concerto," she finished for him. "I don't play wrong notes." For the first time since she'd woken up in his bed, a slow, genuine smile touched the corner of his mouth. It transformed his face, erasing years of hardness. "All right, pianist," he said, his voice laced with a new kind of respect. "Let's write some music." He unpinned the large map from the wall and unrolled it across the vast surface of his desk, weighing the corners down with heavy books. Blueprints of buildings and handwritten notes were scattered around its edges. The war room had been opened, and she had just been invited inside. He handed her a red pen. Their fingers brushed, a brief, electric touch that was no longer about forbidden attraction, but about alliance. "Trust. He thinks you're my captive," Marcus began, his finger tracing a street in the French Quarter. "So, where would a desperate captive try to escape?" The question was a test. Elena looked at the map, but she saw a stage. "Not through the front door. Too obvious. Not through the back, too guarded." Her eyes found the garden. "He'd expect me to try for freedom. A cry for help to a stranger. Something public." Her gaze sharpened. "We need a location where he thinks I'm vulnerable, but you have absolute control." They worked for hours, the light outside fading from gold to bruised purple. He asked her questions, sharp and tactical, and she answered with an insight that continually surprised him. She understood timing, misdirection, and the power of a single, perfectly placed action to draw every eye in the room. Her mind, so used to navigating the intricate architecture of a sonata, saw patterns he had missed. Their bond was reforging, shifting from protector and protected to something far more dangerous, and far more real. They were partners. The air in the study was thick with the scent of old paper and stale coffee. Hours had bled away. Outside, the city had gone quiet, but inside, under the focused glow of a single desk lamp, a war was being planned. Elena stood beside Marcus, their shoulders nearly touching as they leaned over the massive map of the French quarter. Red ink marked potential routes, ambush points, and sight lines. The fear that had once paralyzed her had been replaced by a sharp, humming focus. She felt like she was composing the most dangerous piece of music she had ever attempted. A sharp, decisive knock on the study door made them both look up. The intensity of the moment shattered. "Enter," Marcus called out, his voice rough from hours of quiet strategy. The door opened to reveal a man with tired eyes and a rumpled suit. He was older, with gray creeping at his temples, and he moved with an air of quiet competence. He gave Elena a brief, respectful nod before turning his full attention to Marcus. "Leo," Marcus said, his tone shifting from strategist to boss. "What do you have?" "I found him," Leo said, his voice low and even. "The bartender at the Twisted Vine, corner of Toulouse and Chartres. The one who saw the car." Elena's breath caught. "The car from the accident." He was reluctant to talk. Leo continued, placing a small USB drive on the edge of the desk. But he remembered. And his security camera caught the whole street. Marcus's eyes narrowed. He looked from Leo to the drive. "What did it catch, Leo?" Leo took a deep breath. "It caught Falcone's men. 2 of them. They were parked a block away for nearly an hour before you came down that street. The footage shows them watching the music studio." He paused, letting the weight of his next words land. "They watched Miss Morrison leave. They waited for her to get to the middle of the street. They timed it with the storm. The world tilted on its axis." Elena gripped the edge of the desk to keep from swaying, the polished wood cold beneath her trembling fingers. The sound in the room seemed to fade, replaced by a dull roar in her ears. "It wasn't an accident," Leo stated, his voice a final, damning verdict. "It was an appointment. They hit her just hard enough to incapacitate her, not to kill. They knew you'd be the next car along. They knew you wouldn't leave an innocent woman in the street. They were counting on it. It wasn't random." The thought struck her with the force of a physical blow. Her mind struggled to catch up with the horrible, clarifying truth. She had been chosen. Out of everyone on that rainy street, they had pointed at her and said, "Her. She will be the one." She wasn't a victim of chance, she was a meticulously selected tool. A key designed to unlock Marcus's world. She looked at Marcus. He hadn't moved. He stood perfectly still, a predator coiled and ready to strike. But the calculated coolness in his eyes was gone, replaced by something she had never seen before, a cold, righteous fury that seemed to burn the very air around him. The red pen he was still holding in his hand snapped with a sharp crack, the 2 halves falling silently onto the map. He didn't just feel protective. He felt responsible. His enemy hadn't just found a weakness, they had created one, using her body, her life, as their raw material. He finally moved, his gaze shifting from Leo to her. The fury in his eyes softened with a flicker of something else, something raw and apologetic. "They didn't just come after me," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated through the floor. "They came for you." In that moment, everything shifted. The last of her fear burned away, leaving behind a cold, hard certainty. Marcus O'Connor was not her captor. He wasn't the monster who had locked her away. He was the only person in the world who could deliver justice for what had been done to her. The lines were no longer blurry. There was a villain, and he had a name. And there was a protector, standing right beside her. Their bond, forged in secrets and attraction, was now sealed in the promise of retribution. Her hand rested on the map beside his clenched fist, a silent vow. The performance was about to begin. The blueprints for the Orpheum Grand were spread across the desk, a labyrinth of white lines on a stark blue background. Leo had found Falcone's nest. An abandoned theater, left to rot in the heart of the city. A place of ghosts and faded velvet. Elena stared at the plans, a cold knot of dread tightening in her stomach. A theater should have been her sanctuary, but this one felt like a tomb waiting to be filled. Marcus and his men stood around the desk like generals planning an invasion. They saw hallways as firing lanes and balconies as sniper perches. They spoke in clipped, tactical terms, pointing out entry points and structural weaknesses. Elena listened, her initial fears slowly being replaced by something else, a dawning realization that made her blood hum. They were seeing it all wrong. "You can't go in through there," she said, her voice cutting through their low murmurs. 4 pairs of eyes turned to her. Leo looked surprised, 2 of the guards looked annoyed, but Marcus just looked at her, his expression neutral, waiting. "Why not?" one of the guards asked, his tone condescending. "It's a direct line to the main stage." Elena moved closer, her finger tracing a long, narrow corridor on the blueprint. "Because this isn't just a hallway. It's a backstage corridor. It's built like an echo chamber. A single footstep on that concrete floor will sound like a gunshot in the main hall. He'll hear you coming a mile away." The guard fell silent, his face a mixture of disbelief and grudging respect. Elena felt a surge of confidence, a feeling she hadn't realized she'd lost. This was her world. She knew its secrets. Her finger moved to the grand circle. "And this spot here," she said, pointing to a box seat. "You think it's a good vantage point, but it's not. The sight line is blocked by that pillar. It's a classic architectural flaw. It's a blind spot." She looked up and met Marcus's gaze. He was watching her, a strange, intense light in his eyes. He saw it. He understood. "They're not seeing a building," she explained, her voice gaining strength. "They're seeing a stage. Every part of it was designed for performance, for illusion. For acoustics and sight lines and misdirection." She pointed to a series of thin lines above the stage area. "What about the catwalks? The fly system? You can move an entire team above their heads, and they'll never know you're there until it's too late." Marcus leaned in, his focus entirely on her. "Show me," he commanded, his voice a low rumble. For the next hour, the study was her classroom. She showed them the hidden service tunnels used by stagehands, the dead zones for sound beneath the orchestra pit, the trap doors on the stage floor that were likely rusted but still usable. She explained how the heavy velvet curtains could absorb the sound of a struggle, how the maze of dressing rooms could be used to confuse and separate Falcone's men. The plan shifted. It was no longer a blunt instrument of force. It was becoming a complex, elegant trap. A high-stakes performance with only one show, and no room for error. It was her composition, written in red ink on a blueprint. "So Falcone's men will be here," Marcus said, tapping a spot in the center of the main floor. "We'll use the catwalks, like you said. But we need a distraction. Something to hold his attention." His gray eyes locked on hers, and she knew what he was going to say before the words left his mouth. "There's a piano on that stage," he said. It wasn't a question. A grand, left to rot with the rest of the theater. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. The centerpiece of the trap. The final, crucial note. "It will be the only thing on the stage with a light on it," he continued, his voice painting the scene. "A single spotlight. He'll be drawn to it. He'll think it's a taunt. A symbol of his prize." He was asking her to be the bait. To sit alone in the darkness, the only visible target in a theater full of shadows and men with guns. "The plan only works if you're the one playing," he finished, his gaze unwavering, searching her face for any sign of hesitation. She thought of the broken umbrella in the rain, of the feeling of her future being stolen from her. She thought of the crushed rose. The stage had been set for her, chosen by her enemy. But she would be the one to write the final act. She looked at him, her gaze as steady as his. "What piece do you want me to play?" The house was holding its breath. The plans were laid, the pieces were in place, and the silence that settled over the grand townhouse was heavier than any sound. Sleep was impossible. Every time Elena closed her eyes, she saw the dark, dusty stage of the Orpheum Grand, a single spotlight cutting through the blackness. Her heart hammered a frantic, unsteady rhythm against her ribs, a counterpoint to the slow, heavy ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. She couldn't stay in bed. The need for the familiar, solid weight of the piano keys pulled her from the room. She padded barefoot down the moonlit hallway to the music room, a ghost in a borrowed silk robe. The magnificent piano was a black silhouette in the darkness, its polished surface reflecting the slivers of moonlight that pierced the tall windows. She didn't turn on a lamp. She didn't need one. Her fingers found the keys, and she began to play. It wasn't a performance. It was a prayer. A soft, melancholic melody drifted into the still air, a song full of questions and quiet sorrows. It was the sound of a storm that had passed, leaving a fragile, uncertain peace in its wake. She poured every ounce of her fear, her confusion, and the terrifying, undeniable warmth she felt for the man in the room down the hall into the music. She didn't hear him enter, but she felt the shift in the air. The space behind her was suddenly charged, occupied. The music faltered for a half-second before she found the melody again, her fingers refusing to betray her nerves. He didn't stay in the shadows this time. Marcus walked into the room, his footsteps silent on the thick rug, and came to a stop beside the piano. He leaned against it, his hip brushing the polished wood, his arms crossed over his chest. He just listened, his face an unreadable mask in the gloom. When she played the final, fading note, it hung in the air between them, a fragile, shimmering thing. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything they hadn't said. "I used to think the quiet was the only peace I could find," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the body of the piano. "But it was never quiet. Not really." He looked at her, and in the faint moonlight she saw the raw exhaustion in his eyes. "There was always a storm in here." He tapped his temple, near the faint, silvery scar. "Always raging." He paused, and his gaze dropped to her hands, still resting on the ivory keys. "Your music, it's the only thing that's ever made it stop." The confession landed in the quiet room with the force of a physical blow. It was the most vulnerable, most honest thing he had ever said to her. It was a truth that stripped away the last of his armor, leaving him completely exposed. He pushed himself away from the piano and walked to the window, staring out at the sleeping city. "Tomorrow is going to be dangerous," he said, his back to her. "I brought you into this. I put you on that stage. There's a car waiting in the alley behind the house. Leo will drive you. He can take you anywhere in the country, give you enough money to start over, a new name. No one will ever find you. You can be free of all of this." He turned to face her, his expression grim, his hands clenched at his sides. He was giving her a choice. A real one. He was offering to let her go, to undo the gilded cage he had built, even if it meant facing the storm alone. It was the greatest act of care he had shown her yet. Elena looked at him, at this dangerous, broken man who found peace in her music. She thought of the life he was offering her, a quiet, safe existence where she would always be looking over her shoulder, a ghost haunted by an unfinished melody. Then she thought of the stage tomorrow, of the terror and the risk, and the chance to finally face the men who had tried to break her. Slowly she shook her head. Her gaze was steady, her decision absolute. She reached out and placed her hand over his, where it rested on the edge of the piano. His skin was warm, his scarred knuckles hard beneath her palm. "The piece isn't over," she said, her voice clear and strong in the silent room. "I'm seeing it through to the end." A flicker of disbelief, then a wave of profound relief, washed over his face. He turned his hand over, his fingers lacing through hers, his grip firm and sure. He wasn't her captor, and she wasn't his prisoner. They were partners. And tomorrow, they would take the stage together. The air in the Orpheum Grand tasted of dust and decay. It was a thick, heavy scent, like forgotten memories and rotted velvet. Elena felt it coat her tongue as she stepped through a side entrance, the darkness of the theater swallowing her whole. It wasn't a complete blackness. Faint slivers of moonlight cut through grime-covered skylights high above, illuminating a ghostly world. Dust motes danced in the pale beams, tiny stars in a dead universe. Rows upon rows of seats, shrouded in white sheets, looked like a silent, staring audience of ghosts. Marcus's hand was a firm, warm pressure on the small of her back, guiding her through the gloom. His men moved around them like smoke, their footsteps impossibly silent on the decaying carpets. They were shadows detaching from other shadows, melting into positions in the balconies and wings. Elena's heart hammered a frantic, terrified rhythm against her ribs, but her feet were steady. She was walking toward the most dangerous moment of her life, and a strange, cold calm had settled over her. The stage was a vast, empty island in the center of the cavernous space. And on that island sat the piano. As they drew closer, she could see it was a ghost of the instrument in Marcus's home. Its black lacquer was dulled by a film of dust, its keys yellowed like old teeth. It looked lonely and forgotten. Marcus led her up a short flight of stairs at the side of the stage. His hand left her back, and the loss of its warmth was a physical shock. He leaned in, his voice a low whisper meant only for her. "Stay in the light. Play when it goes dark. I'll be right here." She nodded, unable to speak. He gave her one last, intense look before melting back into the shadows. She was alone. Elena walked to the piano, her footsteps echoing in the profound silence. She sat on the worn bench, the wood cold through her thin dress. A single, harsh spotlight flickered on from somewhere high above, pinning her in a perfect, brilliant circle of light. She was the only thing alive in the entire theater. She placed her hands over the keys, not pressing down, just feeling their dusty, solid presence beneath her fingertips. She was the bait. The lure. The first note in a deadly performance. The wait was agonizing. Seconds stretched into minutes. The only sounds were the creak of the old building settling and the frantic beat of her own blood in her ears. Then, a new sound. The groan of a heavy door being forced open at the back of the theater. Heavy, confident footsteps followed, echoing with an arrogance that desecrated the silence. Voices, rough and loud, bounced off the decaying plaster. "So dramatic, O'Connor!" a voice boomed, dripping with contempt. "Making us come all this way for a private show?" Elena's entire body went rigid. Falcone. She watched as three figures emerged from the darkness of the main aisle and walked toward the stage. The man in the middle was broad and wore a slick, expensive suit. He moved with the swagger of a man who believed he had already won. A shadow detached itself from a pillar near the stage. Marcus. He stepped into the dim spillover from Elena's spotlight, his hands empty at his sides, his body deceptively relaxed. "You wanted my attention, Falcone," Marcus said, his voice calm and lethal. "You have it." Falcone laughed, a short, ugly bark of a sound. He stopped 20 feet away, his men fanning out on either side of him. His eyes flickered from Marcus to Elena, a dismissive, predatory glint in them. "I have more than your attention. I have your weakness, right there on a pedestal for the whole world to see." He gestured to her with a flick of his wrist. "All this for a little songbird? You've gone soft." Elena's fingers tightened on the edge of the piano. She wasn't a songbird. She was the opening chord of his destruction. She met Marcus's gaze across the stage, and he gave her a nearly imperceptible nod. The signal. It was time. The signal was a ghost of a movement, a slight dip of Marcus's chin, but Elena's eyes were locked on him, and she saw it as clearly as a flash of lightning. Her heart seized in her chest. Her hands, poised over the yellowed keys, trembled for a single, terrifying second. This was it. The performance began now. Then, the world ended. One moment she was pinned in a circle of harsh, artificial light. The next, she was plunged into an absolute, suffocating blackness. A collective gasp echoed through the theater, followed by a string of curses from Falcone's men. The blackout was so total, so sudden, it felt like a physical blow. For a heartbeat, there was only the sound of panicked breathing and the frantic pounding of Elena's own blood in her ears. Then chaos erupted. A few emergency lights flickered on, casting long, monstrous shadows that danced and writhed across the decaying walls. Men became distorted giants, their movements jerky and terrifying. A voice shouted an order. A metallic click echoed from the darkness. In that split second of confusion, Elena drew a deep, ragged breath. Her fear was a cold, hard stone in her stomach, but her hands were steady now. This was her stage. This was her cue. She brought her hands down on the keys. The first chord was a brutal, thundering explosion of sound that ripped through the chaos. It was a declaration of war. It wasn't Chopin, and it wasn't Bach. It was the sound of a storm, the same furious, untamed energy of the night they met. The music poured from her, a torrent of frantic arpeggios and crashing, dissonant chords that clawed at the air. It was the sound of screeching tires, of thunder breaking overhead, of a life being torn apart and pieced back together into something stronger. A muffled shout came from her right, swallowed by the swell of her music. She played louder, her fingers flying across the keys with a precision born of pure rage. The dust on the old piano rose in a cloud around her, dancing in the flickering emergency lights. She was the only thing of substance in a world of shadows, the still point at the center of the hurricane she was creating. Pop, pop, pop. The sounds were sharp, ugly, but her music absorbed them, turning the gunshots into a hellish percussive beat. They were just another instrument in her violent orchestra. She heard the scuffle of feet, the sickening thud of a body hitting the floor, but she didn't look. She couldn't. Her eyes were closed, her entire being focused on the 88 keys beneath her hands. She was no longer the bait. She was the weapon. Her music was the shield for Marcus's men and the disorienting force that confused his enemies. She was controlling the battlefield, not with a gun, but with her art. This was her power. This was her reclaiming everything that had been taken from her. The piece built, layer upon layer of fury and sound, climbing towards an impossible crescendo. It was a scream, a roar, a final, defiant cry. She poured every last ounce of her terror and her strength into it, her entire body shaking with the force of the music. The final chord was a cataclysm. She struck the keys with all her might, a single, sustained, earth-shattering sound that shook the very foundations of the old theater. And then she lifted her hands. The sound was severed as if by a knife. The echo died. Silence. Absolute, deafening, and complete. The silence in the theater was a living thing, a heavy, ringing presence that pressed in on Elena from all sides. Her hands, still hovering over the keys, began to shake, the adrenaline deserting her in a sudden, violent crash. The emergency lights continued to cast their sickly, flickering glow over the scene. She could see shapes in the darkness now, still forms on the floor, and the shadows of Marcus's men moving with quiet, deadly efficiency. A single, powerful beam of a flashlight cut through the gloom, finding her on the stage. She flinched, raising a hand to shield her eyes. The beam lowered, and then Marcus was walking towards her, his form materializing out of the darkness. He moved past the wreckage of the fight without a second glance, his eyes fixed only on her. He mounted the steps to the stage, and his footsteps were the only sound in the cavernous space. He stopped in front of the piano, his face a mixture of awe and a concern so deep it made her ache. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before his fingers gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek. His touch was feather-light, reverent. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice a raw whisper. She could only nod, the word trapped in her throat. He took her trembling hand in his grip warm and solid. His scarred thumb stroked the back of her hand, a small, grounding comfort in the midst of the carnage. He pulled her gently to her feet, and she leaned against him, her strength completely gone. The fight was over. The storm had passed. The ride back to the townhouse was silent. The city lights blurred past the tinted windows, a world away from the violence they had left behind. Back inside the beautiful house, the silence was different. It wasn't tense or dangerous anymore. It was simply empty. The reason she was here, the threat that had bound her to him, was gone. She was no longer a protected guest or a liability. She was just here. The thought was both liberating and terrifying. He found her in the music room, standing by the magnificent grand piano, her hand resting on its polished lid. He didn't turn on the lights, allowing the soft glow from the hallway to spill into the room, painting them both in shades of gold and shadow. "It's over," he said, his voice quiet. "Falcone is gone. You're safe now." Elena turned to face him. The words hung in the air, the two words she had once longed to hear. "You're safe." But safety meant the gilded cage was no longer necessary. The door was, for the first time, truly open. He took a step closer, his gaze intense, pleading. "Stay with me, Elena." The words were quiet but held the weight of his entire world. "Don't stay as my guest. Not as someone I have to protect." He took another step, closing the distance between them. "Stay as my partner. My equal. This house, this city, all of it. It's yours if you want it." It was everything. He was laying his kingdom, his scarred and broken heart, at her feet. He was offering her a world of wealth and power, and most shockingly, his complete devotion. A part of her, the part that was tired and scared and had grown to care for this dangerous man, screamed to say yes. To stay in the safety of his arms, to fill this beautiful house with music and never face the cold, harsh world alone again. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring his image. But she saw the stage in the abandoned theater. She felt the power thrumming through her fingertips as she played, not for an audience, not for a captor, but for her own survival, for her own soul. She had found herself in that darkness. "I can't," she whispered, and the words shattered the perfect, fragile moment between them. She saw the hurt flash in his eyes before he masked it. "I can protect you. I can give you anything." "I know," she said, a tear finally escaping and tracing a hot path down her cheek. "But don't you see? I don't want to be protected anymore." She gestured around the beautiful room, at the priceless art and the silent, waiting piano. "If I stay, I'll be choosing your world. My music will be for you, in these walls. I'll be safe, but I won't be free." She met his gaze, her own full of a strength she didn't know she possessed. "On that stage tonight, I wasn't your weakness. I was myself. I have to go back to that. To my own stage, my own life." It was the hardest choice she had ever made, a choice born not of fear, but of a newfound love for herself. He stared at her for a long, silent moment, the battle of his heart playing out on his face. She saw the possessive man who wanted to lock her away, and the broken man who needed her music to be whole. Then she saw something else emerge, the man who loved her enough to understand. In his greatest act of love, he nodded, a slow, painful acceptance. He was letting her go. 6 months. It felt like a lifetime. The stage was no longer a dusty island in a sea of shadows. It was a brightly lit world of polished wood and blinding light. The air didn't taste of decay, but of expensive perfume and the electric anticipation of 1,000 people holding their breath. Elena's hands, once trembling in the dark, were now steady and sure on the cool ivory keys of a world-class Steinway. She was playing Chopin. Not the frantic, desperate melodies of her past, but a nocturne so full of quiet strength and heartbreaking beauty it seemed to still the very air in the concert hall. The music flowed from her, no longer a weapon or a shield, but a pure, joyful extension of herself. Every note was a testament to her survival, every chord a declaration of her freedom. She had never played better. Her past was not a ghost that haunted her, it was the iron in her blood, the force that gave her music a depth and power it had never possessed before. When the final, shimmering note faded into the vast, silent hall, the quiet held for a single, perfect beat. Then, the world erupted. Applause crashed over her in a deafening wave, a thunderous roar of approval and adoration. The audience was on its feet, their faces a blur of admiration beyond the stage lights. 1,000 strangers were telling her she was brilliant, that she was a star. It was everything she had ever dreamed of. It was the future she had reclaimed. Elena rose from the piano bench, her body moving with a newfound grace. She walked to the center of the stage and took a deep bow, a genuine smile touching her lips as the sound washed over her. She felt a profound, bone-deep gratitude for this moment, for this life. But as she straightened up, Her eyes began a practiced, secret search of the crowd. Her gaze swept past the expensive seats in the orchestra section, past the cheering faces in the mezzanine. She wasn't looking for a familiar face in the crowd. She was looking for a shadow. Her eyes lifted higher, to the deep, velvet-lined private boxes that curved along the upper walls of the theater, places for the rich and the reclusive. They were mostly empty or filled with laughing patrons. Except for one. High up, in the deepest shadows of the box on the far left, a figure stood. Her breath caught in her throat. The light didn't touch him, rendering him a perfect, imposing silhouette against the dim background. She couldn't see his face, couldn't make out the scar near his temple or the startling gray of his eyes. But she didn't need to. She knew the breadth of those shoulders, the unwavering stillness of that stance. She would know him in any darkness, in any lifetime. Marcus. The roar of the crowd faded to a dull hum in her ears. He wasn't clapping. He never did. He simply stood there, a silent guardian watching over her kingdom from the walls of his own. He was keeping his promise, respecting her choice to leave his world, but his presence was a vow. I am still here. I am still watching. You are not alone. The applause swelled again, demanding another bow. Elena dipped her head, her heart a wild, frantic drum against her ribs. When she rose again, her eyes found the shadow in the box one last time. The thousand faces below her disappeared. There was only him. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a secret message sent across a sea of strangers. It was a thank you. It was an acknowledgement. It was an answer. The heavy red curtain began to fall, a final, sweeping barrier between her world and the audience. But she knew, even as it closed, that he was still there. The connection remained, a beautiful, dangerous secret played in the silence after the music was over. If you enjoyed the video, tell us where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel to keep up with our content.